This is the theBreaker.news podcast for the week of March 15th, 2020. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of theBreaker.news and host of the theBreaker.news podcast. Welcome to edition number 125. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support The Breaker. On this edition, headlines from the Pacific Rim and Pacific Northwest. The Is It Just Me commentary. I talked to sports economist Victor Matheson of the College of the Holy Cross. He joins me from Worcester, Massachusetts to talk about the economic impacts of coronavirus cancellations and pandemic postponements on the sports world. And there are no Vancouver Whitecaps or Vancouver Canucks games for the time being. Whistler Blackcomb closed down for at least a week, and that could have a bigger impact on BC's economy. Hear what the CEO of Whistler Blackcomb's parent company told investors last week before the economy went downhill. And I will award a virtual Nanaimo bar to a person who is making a difference. Now, is it just me? Is it just me, or did the passel of pandemic postponements and the cavalcade of coronavirus cancellations move fast and furious at the speed of light on March 11th and 12th? The tipping point was when Utah Jazz player Rudy Gobert took ill before a game in Oklahoma on March 11th. The NBA suddenly shut down indefinitely, and the NHL, MLS, NCAA, PGA, and Major League Baseball followed. Here in British Columbia, gatherings of 250 or more people were shut down one by one. So there's no Canucks, no Whitecaps, there was no Monster Jam, there will be no Vasaki in Surrey, and the Sport BC Athlete of the Year Awards dinner will have to wait for another time. You name it, live entertainment and live sports are both on pause. Except for casinos that remain open because the House wants to keep on winning and the House is the provincial government. Cruise ships with more than 500 passengers, which is most of the cruise ships, will not visit Victoria and Vancouver for 3 months. International travel, even to get gas and milk across the border in Blaine, is heavily discouraged by Health Minister Adrian Dix. The province has not yet invoked the Emergency Program Act, so no rationing or price controls of essential goods yet, which means the run on toilet paper continues and hucksters are trying to make a fast buck. Premier John Horgan could only tisk and hope that public shame would work. The public health scare is top of mind, but not far after that is the health of the economy. British Columbia faces the risk of a recession led by the tourism and hospitality sectors. Just to think, back in February, BC was marking the 10th anniversary of the 2010 Winter Olympics and what it did to accelerate the tourism industry and how the buzzword over-tourism was one of the legacies of the Games. For now, over-tourism is over. We can only dream of the day when coronavirus is also over. Just to keep track, the Canada Flu Watch report for March 1st to 7th says more than 2,100 people have been hospitalized with the flu across Canada, 265 are in intensive care, and 85 people have died this season. What do you think? Email Bob at theBreaker.news. Wuhan Coronavirus Pandemic 2020. Now it's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Around the Rim. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Rim. From ABC News Australia, federal government rolls out coronavirus advertising campaign after criticism of mixed messages. The $30 million TV, radio, newspaper, social media, and billboards campaign follows criticism about mixed messaging and delays in broad public education. Officials are emphasizing Australians need to practice good hygiene throughout the pandemic. More than 200 people have been infected in Australia. The chief health officer said closing schools was not on the horizon. This is what the Australian ad sounds like.
Have you recently been overseas or in contact with someone with coronavirus? It's important to monitor your health. If you develop flu-like symptoms, fever or cough, seek medical advice and call ahead if going to a doctor. Then, if your illness is mild, stay home, practice good hygiene and avoid anyone prone to viruses, including older people. Together, we can help stop the spread and stay healthy. Visit health.gov.au to learn more. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
In the South China Morning Post, curfew to be imposed in Manila, Indonesian minister infected. The 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. Manila curfew will last until April 14th. Indonesian Transport Minister Sumadi is hospitalized in Jakarta after he contracted the illness. Meanwhile, recoveries rise in South Korea. And New Zealand announced that everyone entering the country must self-isolate for 14 days. Malaysia reported 41 new coronavirus cases, all linked to a religious event on the outskirts of Kuala Lumpur that was attended by about 10,000 people from several countries. Tech giant Apple closed its stores outside China for 2 weeks and will only sell online as part of efforts to fight the pandemic. Matthew Strong in the Taiwan News reports Facebook shuts down 60 Chinese accounts for fake coronavirus news in Taiwan. Some of the accounts even presented forged government documents. While most of the accounts were registered using the traditional Chinese characters common in Taiwan, Facebook went further in checking their backgrounds, though it remains uncertain whether the trolls have direct connections to the Chinese government. That's Around the Rim on this edition of the theBreaker.news podcast. Now it's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Cascadia Calling. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Northwest. Tan Vinh in the Seattle Times. Coronavirus pandemic cripples Seattle restaurant industry with more than 50 closures in 2 weeks. Eerily resembling the Great Recession, only on hyperdrive, lunch crowds disappearing, dinner reservations canceled, and catering events wiped off the books overnight. Tom Douglas, the city's most celebrated chef, closed a dozen restaurants for at least 2 months after his management team told him business was down by as much as 90%, informing Douglas that he could not afford to pay his employees beyond March 15th. Also, management told Douglas every single catering event they had booked had been canceled. Sean O'Donnell Jr., who owns 4 namesake Irish pubs in Pioneer Square, Fremont, Everett, and Spokane, has asked family members from his wife to his 60-year-old dad to help tend bar and wash dishes. Molly Harbiger in the Oregonian reports coronavirus questions abound in homeless camps. Multnomah County launches effort to prevent outbreak there. Multnomah County has at least 4,000 people living in shelters, cars, and on the street on any given night. Health officials say they are among the most vulnerable in a pandemic like the one sweeping through Oregon. Last week, Multnomah County rolled out recommendations to nonprofit shelter operators. Try to make 6 feet of space between beds, or at least as much as possible. Separate people who are coughing or seem sick from more healthy residents. And some non-coronavirus news because, as they say, the world keeps turning and the geese keep pooping. Oh, wait, what's this? On Czech News, Zamboni brand raises stink over Vancouver Island goose poop collector. During an interview on the TV station, Juan de Fuca politician Mike Hicks referred to a metallic goose poop disposal unit as a poop Zamboni. The machine is technically called a tow and collect. The Zamboni company says despite an email warning, it will not be getting its lawyers involved, and Hicks does not need to worry about a lawsuit. Quote, as you can imagine, the connotation of a poop Zamboni is not really something we want to have out there, end quote, says Greg Dean, the Zamboni Vice President of Sales and Brand Management. And this headline in theBreaker.news this week, David Sadu guilty in U.S. college admissions scandal. Read the stories behind the headlines. Go to theBreaker.news. It's the biggest timeout in sports history across all sports. The NBA. Major League Soccer. The NHL.
Hello, Canada and hockey fans in the United States and Newfoundland.
Major League Baseball. Golf's The Masters. NCAA's March Madness and Final Four. They are all taking timeouts because of the coronavirus pandemic. What does it all mean? For answers, listen to the Big Deal feature on the Breaker.news podcast. Our guest this week is a guest we've had before, Victor Matheson of the College of the Holy Cross, a sports economist, To talk about the sports industry right now. It's the biggest manifestation of the coronavirus fears in North America. The major ones are pausing their seasons entirely, and we don't know when they'll restart. Hopefully sooner than later for the health of the athletes, the fans, everybody involved. The suspensions, postponements, and cancellations move faster than the virus, but the goal is to slow down and stop the virus by keeping thousands of people apart, whether by legislation. Governors in Washington and Oregon have banned large public gatherings. Here in British Columbia, the provincial government has guidelines and is encouraging promoters of larger events to think twice, especially if they have large groups of people coming in close contact. On March 11th, the NCAA decided to close March Madness to the public. The NBA had a sudden postponement when Utah Jazz player Rudy Gobert took ill before a game in Oklahoma. On March 12th, Major League Soccer, National Hockey League, National Lacrosse League, Major League Baseball have all followed with postponements to their season. We don't know when they will restart. Victor, what is the economic impact on live sports in arenas from where you sit?
Well, so normally economists don't think that professional sports or any type of spectator sports is a particularly large contributor to local economies. And one of the reasons we think that is because of what's known as the substitution effect. So, for example, if you're there in Vancouver and you go to a Whitecaps game, well, that's money that if you didn't go to that sporting event, you would have spent elsewhere in the local economy. You would have gone out to the theater or gone to nice restaurants, or you could have gone to a Canucks game, or you would have spent your money elsewhere. So normally we don't think sports is a particularly big contributor. That being said, in this case, it's likely to be a much larger impact that we're feeling on the local economy around Vancouver and other places in the country, because there isn't going to be people who don't go to a Whitecaps game, don't go to a Canucks game, who then instead spend the money elsewhere, because people aren't going out to dinner. They're not going to the theater. They're not going to other entertainment events. So any money not spent in professional sports, it's not getting spent elsewhere in the local economy. It's just not getting spent at all.
We do have, on one end, the millionaire athletes that people pay a lot of money to go see or watch on TV or watch on the internet. But there is another group which will be hitting the pocketbook severely, the hourly wage earners, the food and beverage and merchandise and operations and security workers in arenas, parking lot attendants, suppliers to the arenas, the bars and restaurants near the venues, the hotels where fans, where teams, where media go to. There will be a ripple effect.
Yeah, and that's I think you've hit it exactly here. I feel somewhat bad for the Mark Cubans in the world as his Dallas Mavericks don't get to play anymore, but he starts out a billionaire. I feel bad for the LeBron Jameses of the world, but again, he starts out as a multimillionaire. The people who are going to feel it most, not that they lose the most money, but the money that they lose means the most to them, are exactly those hourly workers we're talking about. We're talking about vendors who are making minimum wage. That means that they're not likely to have significant savings to be able to get them through these lean times. In the United States, at least, they're not likely in most cities to have any sort of paid time off or paid sick leave. And also, particularly in the United States, they're not likely to have any sort of significant medical or health insurance benefits that come along with these jobs. These are people who are going to feel an extreme economic hardship from losing all these events. And again, remember, if you're a stadium worker, you're not just losing games in the NHL and NBA, but you're also losing all those concerts, all the other, just regular people for a night out on the town. These are significant losses to workers in the hospitality and entertainment industry. And again, this is money that they're not likely to make up later.
Do you see any sports businesses having trouble resuming?
So for at least the major league sports, we actually have examples of this in the past, right? All of the major sports leagues in the United States and Canada have experienced extended time off due to work stoppages over the last several decades. So the NFL, the NBA, remember the NHL lost the Stanley Cup one year. So Major League Baseball lost the World Series. And all of those major sports were able to bounce back right away afterwards. In some cases, fans were a little bit reluctant to come back. In Major League Baseball, they had to be lured back by fancy new stadiums and some remarkable individual exploits of people like Cal Ripken breaking the all-time games in a row played that had been held by Lou Gehrig. But the minor sports, those are ones where we are likely to see some significant issues, right? The XFL, brand new football league that just launched. It's hard to start a new league even in the best of times, and these are anything but the best of times. The Arena Football League, for example, was doing quite well until the financial recession of 2008. They had to stop operations for a year when they ran out of money due to the last recession, and they were never able to recover after that. They spent a decade kind of holding on in critical condition and finally closed their doors completely. So again, XFL, there's a national lacrosse league that's trying to launch. The women's sports, the WNSL, the WNBA. Again, these are going to be the ones where we have the most trouble bouncing back from any type of extended layoff.
Sponsors will not be able to get their messages out on a live sporting event like they bought and they plan to. And sports in recent years has become, to broadcasters, the PVR proof, the only PVR proof element on the broadcast schedule. They'll be faced with trying to fill the time in order to keep those eyeballs and keep those ears and keep those people watching whatever the sponsors do sponsor, if they are able to still sponsor the broadcasts. What about that aspect? Because the broadcast industry, the media industry, has really changed in recent years to focus on sports.
So you do make a good point there, and one of the few stocks on the stock exchanges that has actually done fairly well over the last couple of weeks, while the rest of the financial markets have melted down, is actually Netflix. Again, if we're thinking about quarantining huge numbers of Canadians and Americans here over the next several months, nothing better than staying home and binge watching some Netflix. And so that's been one of the few things that's actually survived. You do make a good point that sports has been able to negotiate higher and higher TV contracts year after year, at least in part because sports are one of the last things we watch live, and therefore one of the last things where advertisers can actually put their products in front of eyes where we don't either avoid the commercials completely, like through streaming networks like Netflix, or just fast forward during those commercials when they're on our DVR. So I think that is an excellent point. There is some sort of issue about what does the advertising industry do here. That being said, another issue is it's not entirely clear how all of the contracts are written between advertisers, sponsors, and the leagues, as well as between the leagues and their players about who gets the money when, if you have an act of God sort of event like this. I would point out, however, that none of those, minimum wage sort of workers that work in arenas and in local restaurants, none of them have any of these sort of insurance products that protects them against a downturn like this.
And finally, the big question about the biggest event of this year, biggest sporting event, biggest international business event, essentially, is the Tokyo 2020 Summer Olympics for July and August in Tokyo. What about the Tokyo Olympics?
So I think the Tokyo Olympics has a couple different choices ahead of them. Number one is that obviously things could, if we're lucky, things go through without any interruption. The other opposite end of that spectrum is you cancel them completely. I suspect we won't have either of those outcomes. I think we're likely to have one of two things. One would be having events behind closed doors. Of course, the problem with that is even behind closed doors, the Olympics involve 10,000 athletes from over 100 different countries, as well as the officials and the production crews required to do that. And even if you don't have the spectators in this is still tens of thousands of people congregating around Olympic villages, and that might be too much for public health standards. The other thing you could do, and this would be extraordinarily expensive and disruptive, but you could postpone the games. Most likely type of postponement would not be just a month or two. I would say the most likely postponement would be for an entire year. And so we'd still be hosting the Olympics in the same time frame that we do, but we'd be hosting it exactly a year later in 2021. Of course, Tokyo has about 25 billion reasons to want to make sure the Olympics goes through in some sort of way, because that's about what they've spent preparing for the Olympics thus far.
Do you think that they would not first look at postponing them to the fall?
The broadcasters in the United States, NBC, as well as the broadcasters in Europe, definitely want to keep the Olympics out of the September, October, November range because of the NFL and because of college football and because of the World Series in the United States and because of soccer in Europe. We already know that they're putting the Olympics in Tokyo in a time where it's far too hot to actually have the Olympics, but we're still going ahead with it in August, despite the risk to the athletes themselves just from heat. And we're doing that for the TV schedules. Given that that's the case, it's almost certain that NBC doesn't want to push the programming into the fall. And the next big hole they have in programming is likely, again, that August timeframe the year later. So if I were a betting person, I would say there's almost no chance that we're going to see a postponed Olympics just by a month or two. Instead, we're going to see if we see a postponed Olympics, we're going to see it all the way into 2021.
Okay, thanks very much to Victor Matheson of College of the Holy Cross talking about the economic impacts of coronavirus on sports, professional sports, especially here in North America and around the world. We hope to have you back on the theBreaker.news podcast sooner than later so we can talk about the economic impacts of restarting all these leagues. On March 9th, as the world stock markets plummeted, the chair and CEO of Whistler Blackcomb's parent company, Vail Resorts, Inc., spoke to investors and analysts about second quarter results. Robert Katz said Whistler Blackcomb in BC and Stevens Pass in Washington experienced the lowest snowfall in over 30 years through December 31st, 2019, resulting in very poor results through the early season and critical holiday period. The two Pacific Northwest resorts saw total visits fall 14% from a year earlier. Visitation continued to be poor in January 2020. When the snow came, Whistler Blackcomb experienced a weaker than expected recovery in North American and international destination visits. And then came coronavirus. On the March 9th call, Katz said investors would get a performance update by March 18th. But on March 11th, everything changed. The World Health Organization declared the outbreak a pandemic. That touched off an avalanche of travel restrictions and event closures. On March 14th, Vail Resorts, Inc. made a bombshell announcement to close Whistler Blackcomb and its 36 other resorts until at least March 22nd. Staff will get their paychecks, and another update is coming March 20th. So what did Vail CEO Katz say on that March 9th call? Listen to the highlights, beginning with questions from Barclays analyst Felicia Hendricks.
Are you just suddenly seeing a significant drop-off? Could you anticipate closing resorts early? Are there certain areas that are holding up better than others? Any kind of color that you could give to us that, behind that decision?
Yeah, I would say I think it's absolutely true that there is not much, many weeks left in the ski season. Obviously, they are big weeks for us, spring break and Easter. But of course, then we will, we won't be really, our ski resorts really won't be operating in any major way after Easter. But at the moment, we are not in all changing any of our operating schedules. We plan to keep all of our resorts open. They're all open and operating normally. We do not expect any change whatsoever in the experience that we want to provide to our guests, and we'll be doing that. But certainly, as we looked over the last week, I think following the previous week's turbulence, coronavirus, we started to see declines, coming off of, I think, some strength and actually some pretty positive indicators that we were seeing for March. All of a sudden, a lot of those trends started to change, and we talked about seeing modest, declines, on visits. And I think, that in our minds, as the week went on, continued to worsen a bit. And so a little bit unclear to us where we'd be sitting. It's also, though, to your point about the fact that the ski season is coming to a close in a handful of weeks, it is why we said that we would provide an update on current performance by the March 18th, because we feel like we'll probably have some better sense. We may not have a final sense by then either. And then I think, another piece for us is just a little bit of uncertainty as to how this will affect the Northern Hemisphere summer, where we will have, our Australian resorts coming online. We'll have Grand Teton Lodge Company, certainly coming online. Obviously, all of that much less impactful than our North American ski resorts, but still, they'll continue to be certainly a lot more uncertainty than just a few weeks ago.
That's super helpful, thanks. And the last one for me is just at Whistler, you attribute the shortfall to poor snowfall early season and then kind of the lag effect from that. But just wondering, if you could talk us through how the demand's been from your Japanese clientele there, and if that's been part of it.
Yeah, I don't have a specific data to give you on Japan, but no doubt that the international business there has been soft. I think that I think we were hopeful to see a more quick recovery and a pickup, and just really did not see that occur. And so that continued to be by far the biggest drag for us for this season.
Thank you. We'll hear now from Mark Torrente with Wells Fargo Securities.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for taking our questions today. So prior to the impact of coronavirus, how was international visitation broadly trending, maybe from the major source markets, Japan, Asia, Australia, South America?
I think, in the U.S., that the international business has declined over the last number of years, largely because of strong U.S. dollar, travel restrictions and challenges, I think, being another component. So, I think it was soft, but not a material driver of our U.S. performance. I think it was definitely a decline this year. A large part of that has been the weather. I think another component of it has been, we've definitely seen as the cost in Whistler, but not really, partially lift tickets, but really about the total vacation costs of lodging and other pieces. We've definitely seen some shifting there. But I would say, the primary driver on international visitation to the company is Whistler, and the primary driver of that was really conditions.
Those were clips from a March 9th call featuring Vail Resorts Chair and CEO Robert Katz, 5 days before the parent company of Whistler Blackcomb closed its 37 resorts because of the coronavirus pandemic. As of March 14th, Grouse Mountain, Cypress Mountain, and Mount Seymour all remain open. The virtual Nanaimo Bar brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the theBreaker.news podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo bar to a person or group that is making a difference. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to Stefan Tanguay, a Simon Fraser University football player. Tanguay was scheduled to receive the Harry Jerome Comeback Award on March 12th at the 54th Annual Sport BC Athlete of the Year Awards, but the banquet was among the many events that was cancelled by coronavirus. The offensive lineman overcame insomnia, depression, a separated hip, and back injury to inspire others on and off the football field that it's okay to reach out and seek help. Tanguay will have his moment in the spotlight along with nominees in 14 other categories at a date to be announced when the best of sport in British Columbia are celebrated. You can nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo bar. Send me an email to bob@theBreaker.news. Spruce Hill Contracting, custom homes and renovations. Find more information at sprucehill.ca. That's it for the Breaker.news podcast for the week of March 15th, 2020. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on March 15th in 1990, in Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev's first day in office as the first president of the Soviet Union? His glasnost, openness, and perestroika socio-economic reforms led to the collapse of the Iron Curtain and rise of the Russian Federation. Now you know. Send me your feedback. Send me your story ideas to bob@theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. Sign up for the email newsletter and get updates to your inbox. For news as it happens, follow The Breaker News on Twitter and visit theBreaker.news on Facebook. You can support The Breaker for as little as $2 a month. For more information, go to patreon.com/TheBreakerNews, patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. Until next week.